10 plus 5. If we can't find a 10 plus 5 opponent, we will go 15 plus 10. But hopefully, yeah, we get an opponent. I'm better than you with then spelled wrong. All right, good start to the game. So I remind you that we've sort of switched. Okay, this is a moot point already because d4 is an anti-Sicilian, but against knight f3, I plan to play the Najdorf. So once we hit about 2100, I switched from my speedrun recommendations to my actual repertoire, just because, our opponents are getting strong. So d4 is the entry point into the Smith-Mora. But after we take, white can also play knight f3 and just sort of transpose back into the open Sicilian. Okay, so we're facing the Mora, and there's almost an ideological choice here that we have to make between playing the principled DC, which I really see no point in doing because it plays right into the hands of most Mora players. The move that you play in order to take the fun out of white's setup is knight f6, transposing the game into an Alapin Sicilian. Now, of course, my recommendation with white against the Sicilian is the Alapin, so it doesn't exactly take the fun out of the Mora, but this is a much safer line that you don't have to know quite as well, and, you can play this without fear that you're going to lose the game in 5 moves. So here we played d6, immediately chipping away at white's center, knight f3, and now we can play one of several moves. We can play pawn takes e5, but I think the line that we'll go for in this game is the main line with knight c6. This is the main principled continuation. And now the main line is bishop to c4. And then I have to actually think what I want to recommend in that resulting position. I think after bishop c4, we're going to play a relatively rare line that was introduced to me by Sam Shankland and really test our opponent's, deep theoretical knowledge. Yeah, so after bishop c4, and the fact that our opponent is pausing tells me that they might be a little bit less familiar. Bishop d3. So I already don't know this move. I'm sure that it is a move. I mean, everything's a move. But, in most high-level games, bishop c4 is automatic. So, okay, it's just a developing move. It's not anything special. My instinct with black is to play pawn takes pawn and open up the center and soften white's control over the center. Because after the trade on e5, in many situations, if white misplays the Alapin, what ends up happening is that white is bitten off more than he can chew. So after DE, we can, for example, deploy our bishop to g4. And the drawback of the move bishop d3 is that it doesn't challenge our knight. So if the bishop were on c4 and we played DE, our knight would already be hanging. So this, in effect, gives us a tempo. But I also don't want to play the immediate bishop g4, although I think that would be a very reasonable move, because it gives white kind of a bailout option in the form of e takes d6. So it's hard to say. Do we take on e5 first? Maybe there white can also play knight takes e5, and things get very, very sharp in that position. If we play knight takes d4, it runs into queen a4 check, which I'll show after the game. And so on the other hand, there's a case to be made for bishop g4. Because if, in fact, white bails out with e takes d6, we take back with the queen, and we have, we could say, an ideal isolated queen-pawn setup with our knight already occupying the square in front of the pawn. So let's actually go bishop g4. I changed my mind here. On the basis of the line, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, which obviously precludes the possibility of us bringing out our bishop to g4. So let's just develop. Let's play bishop g4. We're developing in like a very principled fashion. Also possible, I think, would have been the move g6 or even the move e6, like a more modest way of developing. But we're really trying to punish white for what I think is an inaccurate move, bishop d3. Now, whenever you play bishop g4 in the Alapin, if you're an experienced player for either side, you know that one of the things you always have to look out for is this blindsiding move, queen b3. And I think a good way to put it is getting blindsided, because once this bishop comes out, you lose the protection of the b7 pawn, and the knight on d5 is an undefended piece. So queen b3, I think, stems naturally as a way to attack the two undefended objects in black's position. But I think here it's just not as dangerous of a move. We've got multiple ways that we can meet queen b3. For one thing, we can throw in bishop takes f3. Oh, okay. For one thing, we can throw in bishop takes f3. White, I would imagine, has to play gf. Yeah. Because if queen takes b7, I think we've got knight db4 for starters. So do we play bishop f3 and ruin white's structure? Of course, that involves giving away our light-squared bishop, which is associated with a certain degree of risk. I think it's worth it because white's center is so weak that by taking on f3, we're softening it up even further. And white really, unless he finds some tactically original way to play, I think we'll suffer material losses. So now we have to find a calm continuation, and there's two ways to go about it. We could say, okay, we really want to establish this knight on d5, and that would entail the move e6. Of course, e6 involves sacrificing the pawn on b7, and then things get very, very sharp. e6, queen takes b7, knight takes d4, and then there's maybe like a nasty check on b5. Things get super, super messy. Okay, that's one option. The other option is simply to drop the knight back to b6, killing two birds with one stone, protecting the b7 pawn, and removing the knight to safety. So let's calculate e6 for a second, because if we can make that move work, then it's definitely the desirable way to play, because it also prepares to develop our king side with bishop b7. So e6, queen takes b7, knight takes d4. Bishop b5 check leads by force to a better endgame for black, so I'm happy with that. If black plays bishop b3 there, that might be the nasty move. Then we go rook b8, queen takes a7. Because of queen a6, we have knight b4, queen a4, queen d7. Knight b4, queen takes a7. Or rook b8, queen takes a7. And then we play d takes e5. Bishop d4, e d4, queen d4, bishop b4. I think the complications seem to be working out for us. It's very messy, but my intuition tells me that from a sort of general standpoint, we've done everything logically, right? We've developed our pieces. We have a better center, and white's lacking in development. White's only got one minor piece developed. So the arrows are pointing in the direction of the complications favoring us. Of course, that's a very dangerous way of thinking, because you know that in chess, a lot of times the surface level indicators are in your favor, but when you look concretely, always the concrete variations transcend general consideration. You cannot make a move only based on these general considerations, but combined with the calculation that I just did, I think e6 works out for us. And of course, this is also a topic for post-game exploration. So where is the queen exchange? And this is a good chance for especially newer players. You're watching this on YouTube and you're getting overwhelmed by all the variations. You can pause the video. And when I say a line, you can... that's why I always recommend for the higher level games to have a board next to you that you use to make the moves and help you, follow my reasoning as I'm saying the line. So queen takes b7, knight takes d4. And then there's this check which has to be considered on b5. We have to take that bishop. White plays queen takes b5 check, and originally I thought that we were forced to move our king up to e7, which would render this line highly undesirable for obvious reasons. But then I realized, wait a second, we can block with queen d7. And in that resulting endgame, I said that black is better. Why do I say that? Well, largely because white's got this incredibly crippled pawn structure, and after a long think, white declines the capture on b7. Well, I think that makes it very clear what we should do. I think we should play pawn takes pawn. So while white still hasn't had a chance to fully develop, we should really continue striking at white's center. And now queen takes b7 is, I believe, even less of a scary move. But wait a second, let me take a moment here. We might even have to sacrifice a minor piece in some situations. But I gotta go for d takes d5. I mean, we could also take the bishop first, but I don't see the point in doing that. Of course, if you wanted to play this more conservatively, yeah, you could play queen d7, or even like rook b8 would be a completely acceptable Soviet schoolboy type of move. And maybe rook b8 was best. I think for a newer player trying to avoid complications, rook b8 or queen d7 would be excellent moves. I'm trying to play this mega principled, just like I want to make the move I believe is best. And I think the complications have to work out for us after DE. So it's higher risk, but potentially this is higher reward, because if things work out for us after queen b7, likely we're just going to win the game straight up because of our massive lead in development and the fact that white's position is essentially collapsing here. So again, there's like multiple approaches to a position like this. Why didn't I play rook b8? Well, because perhaps white could play f4 and solidify what remains of his center. Although, looking at it with a clearer head, I actually regret not playing queen d7. I think that would have been just much easier to handle. Okay, very good. We're in the thick of things. Our knight is hanging. Moving the knight is not an option. That walks into bishop b5 checkmate. We can defend it with the other knight, but again, bishop b5 is a very unpleasant move because knight c2 check is obviously a lost cause. At the end of the day, the knight on c6 is going to be under massive fire, and with it, we're going to get checkmated. So the move that I think is almost automatic here for me is bishop to, I cannot draw arrows today, bishop to b4 check. And I'm going to play this essentially without further calculation, I know that this is not going to harm our cause. In fact, I'm positive because this gives us the opportunity to castle kingside, which gives us an outlet, right? It gives us a worst case scenario option. In the absolute worst case scenario, we can castle kingside. Yes, we could potentially even sacrifice the knight on c6, but look at the way that our pieces are developed. Look at white's kingside. So potentially we could consider a minor piece sack, then play a move like rook c8, deploying the rook with tempo. And you could even think about, in some situations, the rook infiltrating c1 after a preliminary knight takes e3. So I'm just sort of brainstorming, right? This is not calculation yet because all of this is predicated on where white chooses to move his king or whether white chooses to play a move like knight d2. Against each way that white can defend against the check, there will be a separate type of response. So the first thing that I would like to check in this position is, can we castle kingside? Because if the answer is yes, then that helps us solve a majority of our problems. We really, in that case, don't have to think about moving our king to f8. Things don't get messy. So here's the question. Can we castle kingside? Well, if white takes the bishop there, then it's all very simple. We take back with the knight and we're chilling. If we castle and white takes on c6, well, rook c8 makes sense. And wait a second, I see something very nice. Once the queen moves back, what do we have? Does anybody see what makes this line work? The critical resource. After queen a4, we have a key move, which is, again, based on the lack of white's queenside development. That's what should get you to see that move. Exactly. Rook c8 to c1 check. And you might say, well, doesn't that belong to the rook? No, because the bishop on d2 is pinned. And once the king moves up to e2, we capture the rook on h1. And for extra credit, in that position, what happens if white plays bishop d2 takes b4? Because if you count up the material, in that position, white has two pieces for a rook, but we have one final move that we can play, which really leads to a decisive attack, and that is knight d5 swings over to f4 with a nasty check. Then we pick up the d-pawn with our queen. The answer is yes, we can castle. We're also down to 3 minutes, 50 seconds. But hopefully you can see why. We're doing the hard work in the first 10 moves of this game. Now that we've laid the groundwork, I think the moves are going to be very straightforward. White is completely losing if I calculated this correctly. So that's a really sick line, I think. Queen c6, rook c8, and then basically pre-move rook c1. And we castle. And that's it. Like, once we've established that this move loses, white's position collapses immediately. Like, there is just no way that white gets his pieces out quickly enough because this is hanging. The queen turns from white's biggest asset to white's greatest vulnerability. It can be targeted in a litany of ways. And with the queen unable to rejoin the game, white doesn't have the resources to defend all of these hanging pieces and weak points in his position. Moreover, white can never really castle kingside. That might be the lesser evil, but I mean, for one thing, we can take on d2 and play queen g5 check and just pick up a bunch of minor pieces, let alone the fact that our knight can jump into f4 with mate threats on g2. White is cooked, yeah, and it should make sense to you that white is lost strategically or tactically, I mean, depending on how you want to phrase it, but the play is predicated on queen takes c6, right? Notice how concrete everything is at this level. Just because of this move is impossible, the position goes from potentially winning for white. Like if there was a knight already on a3, for instance, then queen takes c6, you probably wouldn't be winning for white. We would still have a lot of compensation for the piece just because white's king is so bad, but it definitely wouldn't be losing. Because this move doesn't work, the position is very easy to evaluate. So this is likely to be a quick game, but it's still a very instructive game. But we have to actually win. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do. Rook g1. Now we go from highly tactical play to relatively simple play. Well, right now our knight is hanging. It's not really hanging. We can leave the knight on c6, but why would we? Because the knight has a much better place to be, and that is, of course, d4. What do we have to calculate after knight takes d4? Well, we have to, of course, look at bishop d2 takes b4. And in that position, we've got multiple options. I think we can just play knight takes b4. And if queen takes b4, from d4, the knight jumps into f3, forking the king and the rook, but also exposing a discovered attack on the d3 bishop. White cannot hold everything together at once. Is there any realistic threat on g7? No, because bishop h6 is illegal, so we can safely take on d4. Right? This is not to be feared at all. Of course, you have to check, like, does white have, bishop takes h7? No. Does white have rook takes g7? Well, there's nothing there's no pieces on the king side, so why would any of this really work? As long as you don't push the f pawn, you're fine. Of course, f5 would run into checkmate, lateral checkmate. Yeah, so then, I mean, white's like, you know, baking bread while his position is burning, but there's nothing to do for white. Everything is collapsing. And the clock is also dwindling for our opponent. I would play bishop e4 here. I think that might be the best way to stave off the checkmate, the impending doom, because it guards the f3 pawn. I mean, there's no easy way to defend f3 here. I mean, maybe rook g3, but again, we could also then play on the queen side with rook b8, or even try to trap this queen. We could try to surround the queen with a subtle move like a5 in order to try to close off the possible escape routes. But this gets a little bit subtle. I think the straightforward way to attack is rook b8. Okay, bishop e4 played. Let's think. How can we maximize our advantage here? So again, I think the straightforward approach is to play rook b8. And who can tell me, after queen takes a7, what's like a very simple way to involve that rook on b8 into the attack? Like, what's a straightforward? And hey, Yasser, for those watching on YouTube, we have Yasser in the chat, in the house. Take the damn bishop, and then take the damn pawn. And it's not the only move, right? We can play queen a5. We have a million things that we can do, but in the interest of time, try to make these straightforward moves that you know are going to yield a very promising position. Take d2, take b2, and now our rook is involved in the attack. The knight is under pressure, and there's a lot going on this d file. So it's also worth asking yourself, particularly when you're getting a little bit low on time, but you sense that you're close to winning the game, right? You're attacking. Ask yourself first and foremost, like, what is my next move? Like, how can I improve my position? On your opponent's turn, try to generate possible ways that you're going to increase the attack. So what are some moves that you can just like brainstorm on a general level, some moves that are going to improve your position? Really anything, right? Because once you have that laundry list, you can go down the list and more effectively select a move. So I was looking at knight f4 and knight c3 as the two knight sallies in the position. Titan mentioned queen h4, which I think is an excellent move, attacking from the other side. And I think multiple moves win the game here, but let's try to choose something relatively clean. I think the cleanest option is knight c3, rook c1, and I'm trying to find something beautiful there. I think I found it. Let me think for a second. Knight c3. Knight c3 has to be the move. Knight c3 is so natural because it hits the rook and it prepares tactics down the d file. Yeah, this is resignable because everything is winning here. Notice that the other knight can also jump into e2 and potentially fork the rooks on c1 and g1, which is crazy. But when you're this winning, literally everything is going to lead to checkmate. That's just a rule of life. And you can really enjoy yourself as you're trying to find the win. You know, really try to plumb the depths of your brain for the most accurate possible winning line. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm better than you is a username that aged particularly well here. Yeah, this is sad. And look at that queen on a7. There's no more queen side. Like, the queen has done the job that it was assigned. It took b7, it took a7, but this is also demonstrates the power of, it's the combined fact that white's pawn structure is completely ruined, and the fact that the queen is completely out of the game. It's offsides, and these two main factors doom white's position completely, because white's got nothing going for him on the king side. The position just collapses on all sides, and he resigns. The line that I was calculating here, just to pick it up from the end, is rook c1, knight d to e2. Apparently, this is an inaccuracy because of this move, knight c4. Actually, this knight c4 keeps white alive. What I had calculated was rook c2, rook b1 check, knight takes b1, and there's a beautiful checkmating pattern with the two knights forming a kind of mating net. According to the engine, the best move in this position, and I had seen this move as well, is rook takes d2. And this is a great illustration of a topic that I had been mentioning repeatedly, which is that, let's say that you sense that you're on the cusp of checkmate. A lot of people get into trouble when they look only for mate, but you should also look for operations to win material. Like, just because the king is weak does not mean that anybody canceled forks or pins or just a move that wins a ton of material. So after rook takes d2, if white plays king takes d2, then obviously you step back and you win the queen. But what is the best move against rook takes c3? Let's see if anybody can apply this rule and find the most accurate move in this position. Yeah, knight takes c4 also winning there. So a lot of you might be looking at rook d1 check right now, or rook e2 check, or knight takes f3, but there is a much simpler move that avoids all the complications. What is it? And if you're watching on YouTube, pause and make sure that you've found the move. So knight b5, and the game is over immediately. Because not only are you forking the rook and the queen, but should the queen drop back, you're also pinning the other, or skewering the other rook, I should say. And here you can actually take both. You can take this one and then that one, and you win the game. A very inaccurate move would be trying to win the brilliancy prize and allowing, after knight b5 check, the move rook to d3. This is the danger of checking with the queen. These moves like rook d3 are very easy to miss, and black has lost a lion's share of his advantage here, right? It's that easy to do all of the work and then screw it up with one bad move like that, right? And, you know, rook d1 looks dumb when you make the moves on the board, but it is very tempting because it's a thematic move. So you should focus not on winning the brilliancy prize, but on making simple, healthy moves. Also winning is knight takes e4. Simple and powerful. Now, should white take with the knight, you take f3. And if white takes with the pawn, again, this rook takes d2 procedure wins the game based on the discovery, step back discovery. Okay, so many, many ways to win the game. Let's go through the game from the start. Okay, so we faced the Smith-Mora. And I have played the Smith-Mora before in the speedruns. I recommend it heartily with white. But if you're trying to play the Smith-Mora at a higher level, not only do you have to know Mark Esserman's book basically by heart, but you absolutely have to know knight f6, which is the main way of declining the Mora gambit, forcibly transposing the game into the Alapin. Now, there are other ways of declining the Mora. I have experimented with the move d3, but I believe d3 is a mistake. d3 is a move that you make if you want to erase any tactical potential from the position. Unfortunately, after d3, black is simply worse. And the reason black is worse is because white can institute something resembling a Morozzi bind. So I think after d3, the best line is to pick up the pawn on d3. Now, important detail, the move d5, trying to break free, fails to the check on b5, discovering an attack on d5. Simply loses a pawn. Bishop d7, and you can take on d7, or you can even take on d5. No bueno. If black plays the more modest and the more reasonable d6, then you institute like a very good version of the Morozzi bind with c4. And what tends to happen in these positions is black kind of develops like it's a dragon, you know, knight c3. And this is how I used to play with black until I realized this sucks. White typically throws in the move h3 to cover the g4 square. And I think the setup recommended by Mark, although I'm not totally sure, is actually to develop this knight to e2, and then later on potentially to g3 so that you can expand on the king side, potentially with f4. And black just runs out of useful moves pretty fast. Black runs out of useful moves really, really fast. You can pick up the bishop pair. You can play knight e5, and a lot of people get very excited about, ooh, I got the bishop pair, so what? Look at white's control over the center. These pawns institute this total bind on black's position, and the engine actually thinks white is like much better here. The computer likes the move f3 here in order to blunt this light squared bishop, which, by the way, really has no good home. And you kind of play this like you do an accelerated dragon. Like you could drop your queen back to d2. You could try to trade the bishops. You could improve your rooks. Very, very pleasant position for white. Hard for black to find a plan. I don't recommend this line against the Smith-Mora for this reason. You can also play the more sharp d5. And after e takes d5, you have this line knight f6. This is really interesting. I haven't explored this as deeply. But I think that after bishop b5 check, white is supposed to be better. You know, there's some theory here that you could investigate on your own, but I think this line is considered to be dubious for black. For that reason, you can play queen takes d5, which transposes into a line of the Alapin, which is also considered rather dubious. So this could be reached via this move order, d4, cd, cd. And here, typically, black combines that with e5. Interesting line, but I think after knight f3, only white is fighting for the advantage. Typically, black plays knight c6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop d2, takes, e4, knight e5. Again, this is a well-known theoretical line. Daniel Jobava played this against me in a Title Tuesday game recently. I think black is supposed to take and play knight e7, but white definitely is the one fighting for an advantage here. I think queen a4 check is the chessable course recommendation by Kazim Janov. And after bishop d7, this weird maneuver, queen a4, queen b4. The point is to prevent castling and to target this knight on e7. Of course, knight c6 is desirable, but loses the pawn on b7. So black kind of has to contort himself a little bit to stay afloat here. I think a5 is the best move, and now white could even stick the queen on d6. So if you study this line very carefully, it's rather forcing. So you can equalize, but why when you have the perfectly serviceable move, knight f6, which is more reputable? So there are other ways of declining the Mora. What I will not do in this video is delve into the particulars of the accepted Mora, because that's totally beyond the scope of what we're doing right now. Let's instead focus on the Alapin. So if memory serves me right, in this position, there is essentially 3 moves. 2 of them often transpose into each other, and that is c takes d4, which we faced in this game, and of course knight f3, which is how I like to play the Alapin. This is a more flexible move. Obviously, the point is that black can take on c3. But there is also the move queen takes d4, which is considered a sideline, but it's a very dangerous sideline. And if black is not precise here, white can develop a pretty monumental initiative. So if you're a white Mora player looking for a way to rejuvenate your possibilities in this position, consider the move queen takes d4. And Mark, in his Mayhem in the Mora book, does, I think, give some attention to queen takes d4, although it occupies a relatively minor part of the book, as it should, because this is a book on the Mora. Still, queen takes d4 is a dangerous line. How does this... What happens here, you might be asking? Well, typically black plays e6 to support the knight, and white develops the knight to f3. Black plays knight c6, and the main line here is queen to e4. The queen positions itself very nicely in the center, and what's an example of a line where black ends up in trouble? So if black plays the move bishop e7, white is already better after either c4 or even queen e4 to g4, which is a very nasty move. The idea is to meet castles with bishop h6, winning the exchange. If you can induce g6, then you have induced permanent weaknesses on the king side. Now the engine likes to play this move, bishop b5, in order to contest this knight, to soften up the pressure on the e5 pawn. And it's hard for black to make a useful move here. He's very cramped. If black castles, then you castle. And positionally, white is just better here. Queen c7, you can come back to e4. And if black tries to break free with d6, then you can counterstrike with c4. And the initiative really kind of unfurls quickly. Knight b6 takes bishop h6. I mean, you can tell how bad this is getting for black. Okay, so for black to reach a decent position, you have to know this very aggressive move f5. Not an easy move to make unless you know that it's the best move. Now, if white plays en passant here, then everything is relatively simple. White no longer has any control of the center, and this defeats the purpose of the line. You can play d5, and then, bishop d6 or bishop c5, castle, and you play this kind of French style, you get a dream setup. For this reason, white's queen typically drops back to e2 in order to maintain control over the e5 pawn. And here the best move is b7, b5. I mean, try finding this over the board. This is a pawn sacrifice. The idea is to lure white's queen onto a vulnerable square so that now you can play the move queen c7 and hit the e5 pawn. White drops back to e2, but now you reveal the secondary idea of the move b5. Does anybody know what the best move is in this position for black? I'll be impressed if somebody can come up with this idea. Yeah, this is the computer move, but it's well known in 2023. It used to be b5. It's a5, yeah. And what is the idea? The idea is to play bishop a6. Why was b5 necessary? Because obviously, you're not getting the bishop out efficiently if you go a5. So you play b5 to prevent c4 and to initiate this sequence where, queen e2, a5. And if white plays c4 now, then you're in time to play this bishop a6 style. Where else do you get this sequence? You get this sequence in the Scotch. In the Scotch game, which goes e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4. In one of the main lines, you get e5, queen e7, queen e2, knight d5, c4, and now this move, bishop a6, is the main line. Hopefully you can observe the parallel. Again, bishop a6, typical idea. And white's problem is that he lacks development. And if white tries to develop the king side, he is just not in time. Now you play the move a4. And who can tell me the idea of a4? And it's not to grab space on the queen side. It's actually a very concrete idea. What does black do now? And black is already winning here because white's queenside collapses. Yasser got it. Roulettes, I'll get to your question in a second. But what is the purpose of pushing this pawn? And anytime a pawn is pushed, your first impulse should be, okay, what square has been opened up as a result? That answers a lot of questions. And this is a perfect opportunity to apply that. Yeah, knight a5. You pile up on the c4 pawn and on the b3 square. So white cannot defend, actually because of knight takes c4 anyway, which is kind of sexy if I may say so myself. You sack the piece, queen d1, and now knight b4. I mean, just with completely unstoppable threats everywhere. Everything's collapsing here. So white can't defend that pawn. And if white can't defend it, that means he loses material. White has to castle. You play bishop c4 and you win the exchange. So pretty impressive lines here. There was a question, what happens if white plays c4 here? If white plays c4 without escaping to e2, then I think you can play knight takes e5. The tactics work out in black's favor. Why? Because the bishop on c1 is x-rayed. Why? Because if knight takes e5, you can actually throw in the intermezzo rook b8, forcing the queen off of the 5th rank so that after queen a4, queen takes e5, check bishop e2, this knight is free to roam about the cabin. If you had taken immediately, this is a lot less clear because you can't move this knight. The queen is pinned. So, you know, these subtleties you have to know. Queen takes e5, bishop e2, knight f4, and you just have a massive position. I mean, obviously, black is doing amazing here. Not much else to talk about. So that's what happens after c4. White has to play queen e2. You play a5. Now, of course, white is not losing here. If white plays this accurately, the position remains complicated, but better for black. I think knight bd2 is the engine recommendation. And the point is actually not to play c4 at all, but instead to play knight c4. It's important to maintain this pawn on c3 in order to restrict black's knights. Otherwise, you get massacred. And here you drop back to b6, applying pressure on the knight. White has to give back the pawn with a check on d6. And one of the lines goes, queen takes d6, queen d2, you trade, and now you play the positional move a4, once again halting the mobility of white's queenside pawns. And black is better because we have the superior play on the queenside. No, you have to memorize this. Again, these are lines you simply have to memorize. As a Sicilian player, you should know the move b5. Let me check what the recent games have featured. Okay, actually, what's interesting is after b5, g3 is the main move. G3 is the main move. So queen takes b5 is a mistake because of queen c7. At a higher level, the main move is g3. Now you can take a moment and develop your dark squared bishop. Bishop g2, 13 games in the database. And the engine move is still to play a5. Of course, queen takes b5, bishop a6 is bad. And if white castles, you continue to develop your initiative on the queen side with bishop a6. Now the main line is rook d1. Oh, I had a game here from 2012. I forgot about this game. I had an over-the-board game, and you won't believe who it's against. It's against Shakhyar Mamedyarov's sister, Turkan Mamedярova, who was 2277 FIDE at the time. I knew this in 2012. I had this exact position. I castled. This is all still the top computer line in 2023. Now Mamedярova played she played the second most popular move, knight to d4. And I found a really gorgeous idea in this game. And now I played b4, which is correct, opening up an attack on the queen. Now watch what happens. Turkan plays c4, covering the attack. I played knight takes d4, rook takes d4. And now I played the move. There's still 4 games in the database. There's a game from 2018 here, actually. The best move is rook c8. But I played queen b6. And now Turkan makes a decisive mistake. The correct move would have been to sack the exchange on d5. Bishop takes d5 check, king h8, bishop takes 8, rook takes 8. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this looks like a very unpleasant position to play for white. Why? Because of the weaknesses on the light squares. I mean, you have this clear idea, bishop b7, queen c6. According to the engine, white is only slightly worse. That is why rook c8 is the top engine move. And what happens if white takes on d5? Now you have bishop takes c4. And there's nothing to show for the exchange. So here white is in trouble. But instead, after queen b6, Turkan played queen to d2. And I found a really, really nice idea here that wins the game. I think it's a super elegant concept. Pause the video. It's a difficult idea, but I think it's instructive to think about how you should play in this position. Black to play. And most people, I think, will be thinking about bishop to c5, but there is a better move. And you actually go the other way. Yeah, you play bishop to g5. Deflection. If white plays queen takes g5, then it's easy to observe that after queen takes d4, you're up an exchange, and here you're up a king after queen d1 check. But why does bishop g5 look like a bad move? Well, it's because white has f4, sending the bishop back. But what has been the effect of the move f4? Well, now look at how weak this diagonal is and how pinned the rook is. You just go back to e7. And if white plays c takes d5, then bishop c5 wins the game because you pick up the rook and the king is in huge trouble. And there's nothing that white can do about this. Turkhan played the move king h1, and here I missed a double exclam move. I played bishop c5, which is decent, and it wins the game. But after rook takes d5, some work is still required. It's about -3 in this position, and I won pretty easily. But there is an even stronger move that's +6. Does anybody see it? Just an amazing move. You can basically win this rook without allowing this exchange sacrifice that gives white a pawn. It's not rook ac8. I mean, this is like a master level move, so don't feel frustrated if you miss it. It's honestly an impossible move. It's 93. Smash Factor's got it, 93. Now, first of all, it should be pointed out that you're never afraid of this because look at the light squares. I mean, look at the light squares. You're going to go bishop b7, and you're going to massacre white on those squares, okay? So that's something that's not even being discussed. The point is after queen takes e3, either in this position or in this position, you play bishop c5 and you pick up the rook. And again, for example, after bishop takes a8, rook takes a8, currently you're down a rook, but you're winning it back. White has no moves. Bishop d4, you play bishop takes d4, and bishop b7 is checkmate. Look at this, queen g2, bam. Queen c6. Queen trade, checkmate. Yeah, this is how good this is for black if you play this accurately. Now, of course, white does not have to cooperate, and knight d4 is really the mistake that Turkhan played. The correct move here in this position is nbd2. But still, after a4, I really, really think that black's position is much easier to play. Like queen e1, the engine even gives g5 attacking on the other side, and f4. I mean, this is not pleasant for white. And this is part of a category of openings that if black knows this super, super well, you can take the sting out of queen takes d4. Now, there are some other more recent innovations for white. One of them is bishop c4, which has been the choice of a lot of grandmasters more recently. Knight f3 is the traditional main line. So bishop c4, still black is better. You go knight c6, queen e4, and I believe the right setup here is to play nde7 and get this knight around to g6. So for example, knight f3, you're supposed to go knight g6, and if black castles, you pile up on the e5 pawn. You play queen c7, and the whole point is that in this position, who can tell me what black has? 26 games in the database. What's the point? And I know this is a lot of theory, but I really, really want to make good on my promise at the start of the speedrun, that by watching this speedrun, you really are able to build a pretty nice opening repertoire. Like, you're able to pick up a lot of opening variations. So I'm giving you my genuine analysis here. Not b5, you can actually still play knight ge5. You can actually still play knight ge5. Takes, and in order to avoid losing a pawn, after queen e5, queen c4, white has to play bishop takes c6 and accept a worse endgame. de, queen e5, takes. You can play f6, then king f7, and eventually e5. So this is a nice little idea. Knight e7 and knight g6. Nothing that white can do about it. I mean, if white plays bishop f4, which scores well in the database, then after knight g6, bishop g3, you can play this very nasty move, queen b6. Just like in the game, right? The pawn on b2 is very, very weak. And if white plays queen e2, then again you have knight c takes e5, this time for a different reason. This time, you play queen takes b2 at the end of the line and win the rook. So white is just unable to sustain this pawn on e5. If white plays the move f4, well, that's an incredibly weakening move. And here you can immediately strike at the center with d5 and play knight f5, picking up the pawn, not with the queen, but with the bishop. And white's position just sucks here. So pretty legendary ideas here for black. That's an overview of the move queen takes d4. Now we get to the game continuation. CD d6, knight f3, knight c6. Now we've had this position from the other side. Bishop c4 is the main line. I want to do one more theoretical exploration, and that is to show you guys what I recommend in this position, what hidden line I think offers excellent practical chances. And that is the line d takes c5, d takes c5. Now, first of all, let's take a step back. What is the main line here? What is the line that is given in all the books? That's the move knight b6, bishop b5. There's also bishop b3, which is the older move. But nowadays, you almost always get this very long forcing line, takes, knight c3, e6, and you get this IQP line, okay? But there are other sidelines that are not talked about enough, and I think they give black great practical chances and essentially equalize. Sorry, I refreshed because I got disconnected. And one of those lines is to play DE and bishop e6. This is an almost unknown variation. The point is this. After castles, you play the move g6. So yes, you block the development of the bishop on this diagonal, but you can still fianchetto it. Now this looks kind of bad because white can play knight g5. The standoff between the bishops is largely in black's favor. So if white stubbornly plays knight c3, he loses a piece because you play knight takes c3. And after takes, there is the intermezzo on e2, and you pick up the bishop with an extra piece. So the point of this line is aimed against the development of white's knight. Of course, white can develop the knight to d2, but clearly this is a very awkward square, and you play bishop g7 and hit the pawn. So knight g5 is the principled way to challenge this line. And obviously you don't take on e5 here. I won't even explain why. You need to prioritize your development. What I like about this line is that after the exchange on e6, the knight on d5 is super well supported by this pawn on e6. And most people here, well, white has to play f4. And now you have a very nice reshuffling. You play queen b6 check, forcing the king into the corner. And of course, the rook occupies the queen's place. I really like this position for black. Yes, the bishop on g7 is bad, but in the future, you can have tactics with bishop takes e5. White is not very well developed, and it's really, really easy for white to lose control of the game. So, like, if what is natural here for white? Well, queen e2 is the best move according to the engine. And here you have this very tricky move, queen b6 to c5, one of those slow moves that can be very annoying to face. And it's hard for white to develop. If white plays knight c3, already knight d4, queen d3, knight b4, and suddenly white is in trouble. So what does white do? If white plays knight d2, knight e3. Okay, so somehow just very, very hard for white to find a good way to reshuffle his pieces. And that's kind of the line that I recommend. The main move here is knight g5. Gawain Jones, who's an Alapin expert, also played queen e2. And here, the lines do get pretty sharp. Bishop g7, rook d1, and you're supposed to play queen to a5. Obviously not queen c7 because that drops the knight. You have to make sure that the queen maintains contact with the knight. And there is nothing to fear here. 11 games in the database, bishop d2, queen c5. And there are some crazy lines here, like white can play b4, but everything is fine. You play knight db4, bishop b6, fe6, black is fine. Some correspondence games here in this line. Knight a3 was played by a human. You just castle. Rook ac1, and you can just drop the queen back to b6. All of the complications working out for black. In any case, you can do more analysis on your own, but I think we've covered enough openings. Let's get to the game. Bishop d3, in my book, is not a move. And it's not a move according to the engine as well. So again, let me explain quickly. Why did I choose bishop g4 over pawn takes e5? It's because white can play knight takes e5. And knight takes d4 runs into the very nasty queen a4 check. And while this does win a piece. This does win a piece because while the knight can drop back, you can play knight takes c6. And when the smoke clears, you can't protect these two pieces at the same time. This idea is also quite prevalent in the Winauer French, by the way. Okay. And of course, now you run into the situation where this bishop has no good developing posts because both f5 and g4 are covered. Okay, you can play bishop e6, but there's always this bishop b5 check problem. So in this position, I wouldn't even take on e5. Like, I would probably go, like g6 or something. But obviously, this is not the same thing. So to me, bishop g4 is a very important move. Right? Important subtlety. Okay, so I think after queen b3, the position is probably already nearly lost. I honestly think this position is essentially unsustainable. If you reach this position with white, you kind of have to backpedal and you have to play e takes d6. And you have to say, listen, yeah, I'm worse, but at least I can castle and get a halfway feasible position. Now, who can tell me in this position why knight takes d4 isn't possible? Very important to remember this little trick. Why is knight takes d4 here bad? Yeah, it's because of queen a4 check, but why can't I just block on c6? Bang, the bishop hangs. Bishop hangs on the other side of the board. So sometimes you have two pieces on the fourth rank that you have to watch out for. Instead, you should make the solidifying move e6. White probably develops. Black probably develops, so bishop e7, for instance. And you get, this sort of typical IQP position, which is an ideal position for black, but the game goes on. Queen b3 is an attempt to punish us. We play bishop takes f3. gf3 is forced, and e6. e6. And I honestly think that at this point, white's position is essentially on the verge of collapse. Now, what did I calculate? And what did white have to do? White had to take on b7. Bishop e3 is sort of a haphazard attempt to hold off white's center, but white's fighting a lost cause here. White has to take the plunge and go queen b7. Yasser actually proposes a really interesting idea. After e takes d6 to play e6, this is a typical move in a lot of Alapin variations. So even in the main line, you can play after knight b5, knight b6. There is a line where you can do this. I think it's bishop b5, bishop d7. I think Carlsen played it against Gukesh. e6. Or this was not Carlsen Gukesh, but this featured in a recent World Cup game. Or maybe Erigaisi Pragnananda. Prague was playing this for a win. Same idea. You play e6 and you recapture with a bishop. Because here, if white tries bishop f4, it runs right into knight d5. So white's unable to keep this pawn protected. By the same token, here, after ed6, you can play e6. Good idea to put in your sort of memory bank, recapturing with the bishop. Okay, so we go back to queen takes b7, knight takes d4, and bishop b5 check. What does this remind me of? This reminds me of a line in the Caro-Kann. In the Panov variation, which can resemble the Alapin, it can actually transpose into the Alapin in some versions because you often get the IQP structure. But the main line of the Panov is bishop g4, cd, knight d5, and now queen b3. And do you see the resemblance? Bishop f3, gf, e6. You literally make all the same moves. Here, of course, the situation is a lot more complicated. And by force, you can get an endgame that is considered to be dead equal. Now, in contrast to the endgame that we could have gotten, black's got a very weak pawn on d5, another pawn island on a7, and white's got very quick development to the queen side. So you can't compare apples and oranges here. Here, you get something remotely similar, but it's totally different because we have a much more compact pawn structure on the king side. Our king is safer, white is more poorly developed, and that is why black is clearly better. But it's just always interesting to see how similar certain lines can be. But this is, of course, what white should have done. This is the lesser evil. And if you're on the defensive side, you have to sense when that moment arrives where you just have to bite the bullet and say, yeah, I'm going to go for a miserable position, but at least I know the game continues. At least I know that I'm not going to lose like instantly. Yeah, I mean, this is misery. This is freaking misery, but just like the movie. Great movie, by the way, and great book. Or was it a short story? Anyway, this is worse than being in Misery's house. Whoever played her. Catherine something Bates? I don't know. Anyways, position's terrible, but this was the only chance for white to bail out. Once he wastes the tempo and allows us to take the pawn and open up our dark squared bishop, the game is over. And bishop b4 check, very important, developing with tempo. Maybe bishop d2 was not the most resilient defense, but I actually think that against king f1, we can still castle. This is a subtlety that you should notice. Why? Because compared to the other line, no, you cannot give rook c1 check immediately, but you can obviously take on e3 first. Now you give the check on c1, and you give another check on g5, and this is obviously checkmate. So that's easy. Okay, knight c3 was the engine move, and now we just play knight takes d4 with a great position, winning for black. Yeah, there's just nothing that white could. King e2 walks right into knight takes d4, bishop d4, e d4. And there is nothing to fear anymore, because you can just go king f8, and later on you can go g6 and king g7 just sort of fianchettoing the king and getting the king to safety. So I think bishop d2 is a reasonable move. And now the critical move of the game, castle's kingside. Let me display the line on the board. Queen c6, rook c8, queen a4, or anywhere for that matter, and bang. And the line doesn't end there. You have to keep calculating because white does currently have a material advantage, but bang and bang. And just look at how our pieces coordinate. Obviously, this is checkmate. White has to play something like this, and I will let you figure this out on your own. Obviously, this is mate in 1,000 different ways. So, you know, our play was predicated on this. Of course, if we didn't have castles, yes, we could have taken and taken. This is a more primitive way of playing the position. Also would have been completely fine. I did not want to allow this check, but you can always slide the king over to f8. You're completely fine here. So, no problems here. Rook g1 is as good of a move as any, and now bang. If bishop takes b4, we can do a million different things, but rook b8 is the simplest. I think the rest of the game is pretty simple without commentary. Rook b8. Notice that we're playing it very simple. We're just asking ourselves, can we involve all of our pieces in the attack? I'm not looking for sacrifices. I'm not looking for anything fancy. Most attacks are simple attacks. And after knight c3, I already illustrate, we go full circle. I already illustrated what happens after rook c1. So the winning moves here were knight takes c4. But avoiding rook takes d2. I also looked at knight d2 or even knight c2. Rook takes d2, rook takes c3. Oh, no. Sorry, this was the line that I was recommending. Takes, and knight b5. Yeah, rook d2, rook c3, knight b5. Does anybody have any questions? We kind of rushed through the final part of the game, but that's just because it was so simple. White is dead lost. I explained this during the game. But this was sort of an opening focus speedrun, but that's okay. I mean, every speedrun game has a different emphasis. The emphasis here was on developing your knowledge of the declined Smith-Mora with knight f6, also known as the Alapin. Did I cover all of the lines? Far from it. What are some of the lines that I didn't cover? Well, for one thing, there are some sidelines here, like white can play e takes d6 immediately. It's an innocuous line. If white plays bishop b5 here, that's a bad move because of queen a5 check. White does not lose a piece because white can weasel out of it like this, but there's no compensation after queen takes c3 and queen d3. I just should point this out because this is a common mistake at a lower level. People forget to throw in bishop c4. But yeah, I think I covered most sidelines. By the way, knight c3, you play pawn takes e5. And this endgame is okay for white, but it's nothing special. You play bishop d7, and then you fianchetto the bishop. So honestly, not a dangerous move, but it exists. All right, guys. On that note, I'm going to call it a day. I have call time soon. I want to thank everybody for watching. Sorry it took so long to get the next speedrun game underway. But I really only like doing these when I feel, when I feel up to it, and I try to maintain the high quality of each game. Hopefully this did not disappoint. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Yasser, for popping in. Sorry you missed the Blitz part. I did play some Blitz beforehand, but we'll stream again tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.